Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. It's me, the South African Wanderer, and today I've got a little bit of a technical video for you, and it's going to be maybe the first of 3 parts or possibly 4 parts in total, where we're going to walk you through sort of the functions of your camera and help you understand the camera a little bit better so that you can move yourself off shooting automatic and then onto one of the modes that will give you more control, and then hopefully eventually onto shooting in manual mode. So hopefully by the end of these 3 or 4 tutorials, you'll be able to pick up your camera and have it in manual mode and be comfortable to go out there and shoot with it, whether you're shooting with the camera like this one, or shooting in manual mode even on your cell phone. I think the series of videos may help you to get the most out of that piece of equipment you're using to shoot with. So when you're talking about photographs, and especially exposing the photos correctly, I think there are 3 main levers that a photographer can pull in order to get that exposure correct. And each of those 3 levers that you do pull has a different effect on that final image that you are producing. These 3 levers are sometimes referred to as the exposure triangle. But I think before we dive too deep into them, what we need to do is take a trip back in history a little bit, just to understand cameras a little bit better and the photography process a little bit better, so then we can understand why these 3 levers are important. So you would think that cameras are a recent invention, but you'd actually be quite incorrect. Cameras themselves have been in use for millennia, with ancient Greek and even Chinese philosophers writing about the use of the concept of a camera. The principles on which most cameras work was discovered thousands of years ago, and it wasn't named until the Renaissance, but it was then called the camera obscura. How it worked was that you would use a dark room, rectangular or square-shaped room, and you would create a small opening on one wall of the room, and keeping the room dark, you'd let the light that enters through that opening be projected onto the opposite wall of the room. The projection would be upside down, but it gave artists of the day the opportunity to trace out the scene that was outside the room, in the front of the opening that you made, or the hole that you made in the one wall, and create almost more accurate artworks in that way. Obviously, the image that was being created had to be in front of the hole that you created, because of how light travels in straight lines. The modern photograph, or the permanent photograph, is the more recent invention. So while camera obscura have been used for thousands of years, it was only in the 1830s that permanent pictures began emerging. So inventors of the day started playing around with light-sensitive material, initially bitumen and then metal halides, and they were exposing these light-sensitive materials to scenes or what they were seeing through the camera, and the light sensitive material would then capture these images. One of the more reliable methods of doing this was called a daguerreotype that was invented in 1939, that used metal base plate that was shined almost to perfection, and then was coated with a silver halide, usually silver iodide or silver bromide. And then that metal plate was exposed, and an image created, and then mercury fumes were used to develop the image from that exposed metal plate. And then there were fixing chemicals that were used to create a permanent image. This was a long process, but the exposure times that you needed for it were not as great, as previous processes before that, and therefore it gained popularity. I think one of the other reasons it gained popularity was that the French government bought the patent from the inventor and made it free to the rest of the world, except, I think, England. And then because of the popularity of these daguerreotypes, paper-based photographs or photography was invented. However, the paper-based photography didn't give as clear results as the daguerreotypes. And it was not until the invention of the collodion, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, process in the 1860s that the daguerreotypes were replaced. The collodion process applied a collodion to a glass or metal plate, and it greatly improved the developing times for photographs, but development had to be in the field still. This process was then replaced by the gelatin silver process, where gelatin was used to paper that then allowed you to take photographs, and the emergence of rolls of this paper, or roll film as they called it, then almost modernized the process, giving you much quicker development times with multiple exposures in a single camera body almost. And then, going on from, the early 1900s, film-based photography dominated almost all the way to the early 2000s. I think the first digital cameras started to emerge in the 1980s and started gaining popularity after that. And cameras became, smaller and lighter and more accessible to the public. So throughout the development of photography, one of the key aspects has been how long you need to expose, whether you're using plates or the roll film, how long you expose that film to light for, so that you can develop a image from it. The very early images needed multiple seconds of exposure. So if you watch any historic movies or things like that, you'll see they actually make people sit still for quite a few seconds on end, and the photographer would then almost expose the photo by placing and removing a cap on the lens of the camera. So he was the shutter of the camera. So therefore, I decided for the first episode of the series, we're going to talk about shutter time. As cameras developed, it was not possible for the cameraman to be the shutter anymore. So he couldn't open and close the lens manually. and they developed what was initially mechanical shutters. When you press the shutter button, it will lift the shutter, and then depending on how long you've set as your shutter time, it will then close the shutter again after that time. So as the cameras developed, that shutter time could get faster and faster. So you went from having to expose pictures for multiple seconds to, fractions of a second. So half a second, or 1/3, or 1/8 and 1/10 of a second. And modern cameras can do 1/4000th of a second quite easily. And cameras like this one, the A1 that I shoot with, can even do 1/8000th of a second. So it's a very small fraction of time that your image receiving, whether it be the sensor or the film, is exposed to the light. But obviously, the shorter time you expose the image to, the less light is falling on your sensor or your film, and the less exposure your film is getting. So to demonstrate, I quickly set up the camera. We're going to use my sumo wrestler as the subject because he moves a little bit when sun shines on his solar panel. So I just wanted to show movement a little bit. But in the initial test, just look at how the exposure is changing. So I kept all the other settings constant on the camera, and I slowly increased the exposure from correctly exposed, which was about 1/80th of a second. I slowly increased it to 1/40th, 1/20th, and then 1/10th. And then you can see as we increase the amount of time the shutter is open, more light is falling on the camera image sensor, and therefore increasing the exposure of the photo to the point where it's actually overexposed. If you went the other way, so if you decrease the time that the shutter is open for, you'll get less and less light falling on the image sensor, and therefore the image will be more and more underexposed. So that's just the quick explanation of how the shutter works. When changing the shutter speed, there's actually one or two key things to bear in mind on the effects of changing the shutter has on the final image produced. So the first effect, or the first key thing to remember, is that if something is moving in the image, a slower shutter speed, so a longer exposure, will result in an image that has motion captured in the image. So I slowly ramped up the shutter speed from a 30-second exposure all the way, I think, to 1/3200th of a second, using our sumo wrestler as the subject. And because he's moving, you will see that at 30 seconds, the motion of his head and his arms is captured in the image. And then as you decrease the shutter time, so as you make the shutter time shorter and shorter, from 30 seconds to 20 seconds, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, and then into fractions of a second, you see that his motion becomes less and less apparent in the images that you are creating. And eventually, at around, I think it's about 1/100th of a second, the motion becomes less perceivable, and you're almost starting to freeze his motion, even though he's still moving. You're producing the image so quickly that it's not perceiving the amount of motion that he's doing. So you can decrease the shutter speed to smaller and smaller fractions of a second to freeze motion more. So if you have very fast moving subjects, think about a bird that's flying or someone running in a soccer field, you would want to have quite a fast shutter speed or a very short exposure time. So in the range of 1/1000th of a second and greater. I think the other key thing to bear in mind is that if you are exposing for multiple seconds and you're holding your camera in your hand, you're going to have camera shake in your hand. So your hands are not going to keep steady for multiple seconds. So I took my camera off the tripod and was hand holding it. And you can see that the images I get when hand holding at even 1 second are very blur, but this is not motion blur of the sumo wrestler. It's actually motion of my hands moving around and moving the lens, and therefore creating a image that is got lines and shake in it. You will see this quite often in cell phone photography, where people are trying to take photos in low light and they will shake their hands, and you'll get ghost images and things like that forming in the image. And that's why if you know you are going to be needing long exposures, you need to use a tripod. So that's my tripod behind me. I've got it for more than 10 years now. It's one of the first purchases I made in my photography journey. And that tripod has served me no matter what camera system I'm using, because these tripod plates are universal and go on most cameras. So you don't need to be changing your tripod that often. So then the question becomes, when do you use long exposure times? So when do you need to use long exposure times? And there are multiple scenarios where you can use a longer exposure to create images that are more desirable. So obviously the first one would be nighttime photography, where you'd want to get in as much light as possible. And one way of doing that is increasing the time you allow your sensor to see light. And I use it, for my night photography whenever I'm out shooting the stars or shooting, myself camping under the stars. And again, you'll need a tripod to put the camera on and then, give it a long exposure. Another instance where you can use long exposures is for flowing water. So if you've got a scene where you've got flowing water in it, so if you're at the beach or at a waterfall, what you want to be doing is showing the movement of that water and making it almost silky and giving it that milky feel. And the way to do that is with long exposures. What happens when you do those long exposures, though, is if there is too much light, and you'll see it in the images I showed, where I think after 20 or 30 seconds, the images are overexposed because I could not control the images anymore. But what you'll start to need are what they call neutral density filters that then take away light from the front of your lens and allow these longer exposures during daylight hours. And then I think the last application for slower shutter speeds, not one that I've tried myself, is when you are out in the bush and you are panning to show motion blur of animals. So you follow the motion of an animal and you can either blur its background, or you keep the camera still and then you show the motion of the animal itself. It's not a genre of photography that I've attempted yet, but hopefully we'll get that sometime soon as well. I think then on the other end of the spectrum, besides moving animals and fast-moving objects, where you'd also use a very fast shutter speed is when creating those images they make with water droplets and where they mix up cornstarch mixtures as well, and then photograph objects or droplets falling into it and creating those lovely almost abstract shapes. But then again, you need very fast shutter speeds as well as some auxiliary equipment such as lighting, etc., to make that happen. Another genre of photography I've not tried, but where shutter speeds are very important. So I think, yeah, that brings us to the end of the first part, maybe a little bit longer part compared to the other two that's still to come. On shutter speeds, the next video I'll take you through aperture, my understanding of aperture, and what the effects you can get with changing your aperture are. And then the last one is going to be ISO, or ISO as they call it. So stay tuned for that. There has been a little bit of a hiatus on the channel because I was trying to get the series going, but hopefully the second and third video will be a little bit quicker in making, and I will film it. I could possibly film both tomorrow already and have them up by the weekend. I think lastly, just some feedback on that bird photography competition. I unfortunately did not place in any of the categories, but I think it was a great honor just being selected 10 times actually. And I want to thank everyone who voted for me. That was much appreciated as well in the People's Choice. I think there is a prize for the People's Choice, so I'm not too sure if they've already selected the winner of that. But I'll try to give some feedback on that as well.